As Connie mentioned, my name is Donna Clements. I'm located in Riverside, California. I work as a Southwest Regional Extension Associate for the Produce Safety Alliance. And today I'm going to be here to talk about post-harvest water. So this is module 5.2. And just to let you guys know the structure of today, I'm going to follow a very similar structure to all of the previous office hours, and that I'm going to spend about 20 minutes or so to kind of walk through how I would present how I like to present this module during a Train the Trainer course. So highlighting a number of the really important concepts that I think are in this module. And then I'm going to leave the rest of the time open for questions. Because this is post-harvest water, I expect there's probably going to be quite a few questions. So I want to leave ample time for that discussion. And for those of you who have already sat in on some of the other office hours, you'll probably recognize these next couple of slides. These are just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea for some of the instructions for today and our little disclaimer. So just to let you guys know, you are all muted currently. However, this is not a webinar. So this is a normal Zoom meeting so that you do have the ability to unmute yourself. And as I mentioned, I'm going to leave ample time for questions and discussion at the end of the meeting. But I do have the chat box pulled up on the other screen here. So feel free to raise your hand either literally or using Zoom to ask a question, or feel free to write it in the chat box. And either myself or Gretchen or Connie will get to it. And just so you know, this session will be recorded. However, our discussion at the end of the presentation will not be recorded. So Connie's going to stop recording as soon as I stop presenting, and that way it'll sort of be free discussion. As an introduction for the next hour, the reason we opted to do this office hours series is just to kind of remind everybody of some of the critical concepts in each module. And then because it has been a while since a number of you have attended a Train the Trainer course, share recent FDA updates, maybe newer PSA resources, and in this COVID era, tips for presenting remotely. And then of course we have this little disclaimer before we begin that by attending these office hours, even if you attend all 8 of them, this does not count as attendance to a PSA Train the Trainer course. So this is intended for trainers or lead trainers, but it will not get you that trainer certificate from PSA or AFDO. And then additionally, these slides are copyrighted, and we ask you not to publish them electronically or without permission from us or Cornell University. So with that, I think I am going to just jump right into the rest of the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, I am going to be presenting on post-harvest water. So if this were if this was a grower training course or Train the Trainer course, we would actually be presenting this right after the first agricultural water presentation, which is module 5.1. And Tommy did a great job of talking about that last week. But because this is a standalone hour, I wanted to remind you that when we talk about post-harvest water, the FSMA Produce Safety Rule requirements in this particular module do fall under Subpart E. So last week, Tommy talked about the compliance date extension of all of the requirements within Subpart E. And I just wanted to remind you that this section, this post-harvest water section, also falls under that same extension. And I also wanted to remind you that because this falls in Subpart E, those regulatory requirements may be revised. So when I present module 5.2, I don't normally give that big reminder at the beginning, but because this is a standalone office hours, I just wanted to remind you of that. Okay, so just like Connie and Tommy and the others did at the beginning of their modules, I wanted to highlight the way that the learning objectives in this module are broken up. And these follow the same flow as all of the other modules, in that we start off talking about that risk assessment. What are some of the risks that are involved when we use post-harvest water? So this is going to be water used at harvest or post-harvest. And when I present this module to growers, I like to remind them that this module is sort of the beginning of that harvest and post-harvest discussion. So up until now, we've been talking about, practices on the farm, but really before harvest. Now we're going to be starting to talk about harvest and post-harvest, and that's going to continue on into Module 6, which you're going to see next week. The next kind of section of the presentation or of the module is how we implement and monitor practices. And for this module, this is going to be the bulk of the information. So we're going to introduce a number of those glossary terms like cross-contamination, infiltration, and then we're going to talk about water quality at the start of use, and then trying to maintain the importance of, or maintain that water quality as we continue using it through that post-harvest use. And then we're going to talk about record keeping and corrective actions and monitoring. And I actually, in the learning objectives, I really like how this is listed here, and that we have record keeping actually listed before those corrective actions and monitoring, because when I talk about records, I really, especially in this module, I really like to emphasize the point that we're keeping a lot of these records of monitoring practices, especially if we're treating our water, and that's going to be really important in monitoring. So looking at using those records as a tool to help us monitor, and if something goes wrong, say the records show something incorrect, we can use that information to decide on what the corrective actions are going to be. And I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the actual implementing practices part of the module, because this is so much of what the module is comprised of. And I further broke down the structure into 4 different subcategories. And I took the Don approach that he did in Module 3, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a visual overview. So looking at slides 51 to 57, when we start talking about the requirements for water use at harvest and post-harvest, we first start off with what is that initial water quality? Because if we don't start off with good quality water, then it's going to be really difficult for us to maintain a good quality water throughout the use. So first we start off with initial water quality, and then we talk a little bit about what are the categories, or how is water used at harvest and post-harvest. This is where we get into single pass water versus recirculated water. And then we talk about what are some of the key water quality variables to manage. This is where we talk about pH, turbidity, and all of those exciting variables that you guys, I think, love to talk about. And then lastly, we talk about, okay, moving from there, how can a grower select a sanitizer? And then after those sections, we go back into discussing record keeping, corrective actions to keep that flow like the other modules. Okay, so I wanted to highlight here that you'll see in the lower right-hand corner, I have actually replaced those page numbers. So if anybody is following along with their manual, the page numbers should match what you see in the manual. And I believe others have mentioned this in previous office hours, but especially when we're doing remote courses, if you are going to be adding in additional slides, I think it's really important to take that extra 5 minutes, insert the text box, and replace that page number, so that those participants who are sitting at home, they're kind of one step removed, they're sitting on Zoom watching a grower training course. It's just a little bit easier for them to follow along without interrupting everybody and asking what page number you're on. So that's one of the tips that I wanted to give. But going back to this risk assessment slide here, this is kind of where we start off the topic of why do we care about post-harvest water? And I'm not going to read the slide to you because this is an overview, but I did want to mention that when I present this slide, I like to kind of, again, know your audience, and I like to try to highlight 1 or 2 of the relevant outbreaks that we talk about in post-harvest water. So if I were in California, especially maybe Salinas, California, and I was talking to leafy greens growers, I would probably highlight the spinach outbreak from 2006. Or maybe if I was somewhere else in the country, I would highlight the cantaloupe outbreak in Colorado from 2011. So I just wanted to mention that is a great way to try to initially get people interested in this module and perhaps how it relates back to them. And as others have mentioned, I also like to change out these photos, again, to match the audience that's sitting in the room with me or sitting on Zoom with me. Yep. And here we go. So this is sort of the second risk assessment slide. And the big thing that I wanted to highlight here is you'll see I like to use animations when I present. So I like to make the bullets pop up when I intend to present them. You'll see I left this blank here because this is the place when I'm doing a remote grower training course, I ask people to type in the chat box. So when I'm working with growers, I will ask them, you know, take 30 seconds, everybody type out in the chat box, how are you using post-harvest water in your operation? And really the reason that I like to do that is A, to get people thinking about how this module might apply to them. But the real reason is I inevitably end up with a couple of growers in the room or in the Zoom session who do not actually wash their produce after harvest, which is absolutely fine. But I don't want them to think, okay, this slide or this module is all about washing produce, so this doesn't apply to me. So I'm just going to sit back, close my eyes, and relax for the next 45 minutes. The reason I ask them this is that I really like to highlight that when we talk about water used post-harvest, the bottom two uses also fall into this category. So we talked about hand washing requirements in module 2. And then in the next module, we are going to talk about cleaning and sanitizing. So I just like to highlight that those two uses also apply to this section. It's true that maybe some of the module is not going to apply to them. However, I like to focus on that because at least the next several slides are really going to apply to their operations. Okay, so now we're going to start getting into the nuts and bolts of how this module is organized. And when I present this, I like to separate it out into two different pieces. The first one is highlighting that we need to start off with talking about what the initial water quality is and how that water is going to be used on the farm. If it's used at harvest and post-harvest, then boom, we know that these requirements are going to apply. The second category that we talk about is, and this starts kind of midway through the module, is how can we maintain the quality of that water? And a huge chunk of this module is specifically addressing that question. So moving forward, what are sanitizers and how can we use them to maintain that water quality? And I added an arrow here to the bullet that says adding a sanitizer to water is not intended to wash the product. Because if I were going to pick one bullet on this slide that I think is the most important, that's going to be the one. And this is really the primary place in the module where we tell the grower that when you're adding a sanitizer, that is not sanitizing or treating the surface of that product. Instead, it's there to prevent cross-contamination. So I really wanted to highlight that because I think that's one of the key take-home messages here in that module. And this slide is really intended to be a follow-up to that previous slide. So in the previous slide, we said we're using a sanitizer to prevent cross-contamination. Now we're going to remind you, what is the definition of cross-contamination? Remind them that really throughout this whole grower training course, we've been highlighting ways to prevent cross-contamination. We talked about workers in module 2. We're going to talk about other food contact surfaces in the next module. But here we're really talking about water. So that's, again, setting the scope of this presentation before we start talking about water quality and maintaining that water quality. Okay, so you'll see here, this is the first slide where we're really talking about what are the water quality requirements for harvest and post-harvest. We spent an entire hour previously talking about testing water, looking at pre-harvest water quality. So now we're going to continue that conversation here and talk about these post-harvest water quality requirements. And I really want to highlight, again, this last bullet, that untreated surface water must not be used for these purposes. When I've seen this presentation presented in the past. Sometimes I see this last bullet sort of forgotten over, or it's the last bullet. You spend a lot of time talking about what is no detectable generic E. coli. What are some of the examples of uses for post-harvest water? And then this last bullet kind of gets forgotten. And I think this is one of those really important regulatory requirements. So again, I really like to highlight that. Sometimes I'll put a box around it or kind of make it emphasize with animations. But I just want to highlight the importance of that requirement. Okay, so when we talk about doing that initial water testing, I just wanted to throw in this module or this slide here kind of as a supplement. You'll probably recognize this slide is from module 5.1, and this is listed as an optional slide in module 5.1. And this lists some of the equivalent water testing methodologies, but I wanted to highlight here this that first sentence. These are equivalent presence-absence methods to EPA method 1603. So these methods can be used for agricultural water used during harvest and post-harvest. I normally, if I add this slide, I do not spend a lot of time talking about it. I essentially add it as a visual reminder to growers that, oh yeah, there are equivalent water testing methodologies. And if growers are working with a water source that is only being used for harvest and post-harvest, they have the option of using one of those presence-absence methods. So again, it's really just a reminder. And then this is where I would remind growers that in their manual, in the FDA, USDA resources section, this fact sheet exists. So if they have questions, if they are calling up a water testing lab, and they only want to test that post-harvest water source, maybe it's a well in the packing house, then they can reference that fact sheet and make sure that the lab performs one of those tests. So again, just a really quick reminder that I will often throw in. Okay, so in some of the other office hours, you probably remember the use of clicker questions. And I've been finding these questions even more important when we do remote grower training courses. So I think, let's see. These clicker questions are up on the website. So if you were to go to the PSA website, if you go under trainer resources, you will find these here. And we do have 2 to 3 to 4 questions per module. I like to pick and choose the questions that I use, again, to really emphasize one of the points that I'm trying to make. And the way I usually do these is I won't ask you to do it, but if I were doing a grower training course, I would ask the participants to use that annotate function and select the answer that they think is most correct. And I really like this as kind of using it as a way to gauge if the participants understood what I talked about in the last couple of slides. I really like this question specifically because it kind of references the no detectable generic E. coli requirement. And the thing I really like about it is it brings in this definition of potability. So if you look at answer C, when I do grower training courses, especially with growers who might be GAP certified, often they think no detectable generic E. coli equals potable, and that is not the same definition. So I like using this specifically as a way to make sure they understand no detectable generic E. coli is not the same as potable. Okay, so we're going to wrap up our discussion of initial water quality requirements here. And again, this slide is going to look very similar to some of the slides from the pre-harvest water module. But the thing that I like to highlight here is we list untreated groundwater sources and public water sources. I like to highlight growers that you don't see surface water listed here, again, to instill that requirement that untreated surface water is not allowed for post-harvest water use. So again, just kind of going back and solidifying that requirement, because I do think sometimes it is forgotten when these modules are presented. And I also like to highlight here that even though we're looking at the same frequency of water testing as is required in pre-harvest water. So untreated groundwater 4 or more times during the initial year, 1 or more after. I want to highlight, because we're talking about a no detectable generic E. coli, the development of a microbial water quality profile, or MWQP, is not required or not necessary. It does not apply in this post-harvest water requirement. And I just like to highlight that, because when I talk with growers during lunch or at breaks, I think sometimes that question comes up and it can be confusing. Okay, so we talked a lot about initial water quality, and really the next category that we're going to talk about is how is post-harvest water used on the farm? And when I say that, I mean, what management category does it fall into? Is it single pass water, or is it going to be recirculated and batch water? And those are essentially the two categories that we use in the module. And we essentially go over these two categories as a way to help the grower understand what management practices they need to take moving forward. So again, if we're looking at single pass water, it's going to be lower risk, right? We talk about biofilms in the next module, in module 6, or some people talk about them here, but generally sanitizer is not really needed for single pass water. However, it is highly recommended when we use recirculated and batch water. So I will mention here that I like to use photos. So you'll often see me, instead of just showing the slide as it sits in the module, I like to highlight photos and say, okay, look at these pictures. As growers, does your water use fall into this category? And then we can move on from there. And the other thing I wanted to highlight on this slide is what some people call the double smiley faces. And you can see I added a couple of smiley faces in this second bullet. This bullet says treatment is not required, but it can be used to maintain water quality and reduce cross-contamination risks. When I'm working with an audience of growers who maybe are not yet using a sanitizer in their wash water, I will often try to bring up or highlight additional benefits to using a sanitizer, because it is a lot of work. It can be technically challenging to figure out the chemistries. There's a lot of record keeping involved. So in addition to food safety practices and reducing cross-contamination, here is the slide that I really like to highlight those additional benefits. Improved shelf life of produce, or improved quality of the produce, things like that. So this is usually the slide, and depending on the audience, again, knowing the audience is important, I will try to mention that a couple of times throughout the module. So again, I like to use sanitizers too. But again, I like to use the clicker questions just as a way to make everybody stop and think before moving forward into water quality management. Okay, so at this point in the module, we've talked about initial water quality. We've talked a little bit about categorizing how it's used. Now, really, the rest of the module is going to be talking about how do we take this initial water quality and maintain it through however long it's used. And recognizing that there are a number of variables that can impact the efficacy or the effectiveness of some of the sanitizers that we use. And I added this call out box because I really wanted to highlight that the intent here is to ensure that sanitizer use is effective. And I can say the first couple of times I presented this module, I got caught up in that a little bit, kind of picking apart what are the baseline regulatory requirements and which variables are listed as a way just to make sure that your sanitizer is actually reducing the risk of contamination. And I wanted to highlight that these variables may impact the efficacy and the risk depending on the system. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to give some examples of that. Okay, so the first variable that usually comes up is pH. And I want to highlight here The actual requirement, so if you were going to look at the notes, I actually have my binder here. If you were going to look at the notes on this slide, the regulatory requirement actually states that the sanitizer that you use has to be effective. And that's kind of paraphrasing it, but it essentially says that if you use a sanitizer, it is being there to make sure that that water meets the qualitative requirement in the produce safety rule. And that says that the water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality. So again, monitoring pH is not necessarily required, but depending on some of the sanitizers that growers use, particularly chlorine, it is going to have a big impact on its effectiveness. And again, knowing the audience, depending on who is in the room, I will leave it as broad as that. And if people have questions, then we'll often go kind of delve more into the efficacy of pH and how it impacts that. Okay, so temperature is the next variable that I wanted to highlight. And the reason we talk about temperature is because we want to minimize the risk of infiltration. And there are a couple of nice infiltration resources on the website, on the Produce Safety Alliance website, and on the NECAS Clearinghouse, the Food Safety Resource Clearinghouse. So the first resource I wanted to highlight, you guys can find it on the trainer resources page, is what is infiltration? And it's I think it's less than a minute. It's a very quick YouTube video that just kind of walks through some of the concepts that you can see here on the screen. And the thing I like about it is it really highlights some of the photos that you can see of infiltration of different commodities, not just cantaloupes like you see here on this slide. So sometimes during remote grower training courses, I will highlight those resources and I'll actually stream them just as a break. It's a nice little visual break from watching PowerPoint slides. The other thing, there's another resource in the clearinghouse that is actually a hands-on demonstration of infiltration. And I actually did this demonstration for a workshop this summer, a virtual workshop, where I pre-recorded this demo. And I followed all the instructions in this little hands-on activity, and it worked really well. And I think it was really impactful. So that's another recommendation as you guys are doing remote grower training courses and trying to add in different activities. I think that's another thing, because the visual impact of watching how infiltration works, I think, is really helpful, more so than just looking at photos that you might see on the screen. Okay, so we talked about pH, turbidity, pH and temperature. The other variable that I want to talk about is turbidity. And I'm not going to present the slide to you. However, here is where I want to highlight what the actual regulatory requirement says, because when I see this presented sometimes at grower training courses, I think that message gets lost a little bit. So the actual regulatory requirement states that a grower has to come up with a frequency at which they're going to change out their water. So turbidity is one example of a tool. So the cloudiness of the water is one example of a tool that can be used to determine when a grower should change out their water. But it's more of an example of a tool. It's not the end all be all. So I really just wanted to highlight that here. And I also wanted to mention that all soil in the water is not created equal. So when we talk about turbidity, we're really highlighting that turbid water may reduce treatment effectiveness. And that's what we're going back to, using a sanitizer, right, to reduce cross-contamination in the water. So when we talk about turbidity, what we're really worried about is actually organic matter in the water, because organic matter is really what will eat up that sanitizer and make it less effective. So I just want to highlight that, and I'm not going to go into much detail. If there are questions, we can talk about it after the after this presentation. But I really just wanted to highlight what we say on the slide versus what the regulatory requirement is in the rule. And this is actually a place, I think it's on this slide. It is, it's in the resources in the notes for this slide. When I teach this module, especially at a Train the Trainer course, I really like to emphasize the number of resources that are listed in this module. Because I can tell you when I first taught this, I read through every single one of those resources just to give myself a better framing and understanding of why some of these variables are important to treating your water effectively. So I will recommend that you do the same. In this section particularly, there's a really great presentation that talks more about some of these variables, including turbidity and how it can be measured. Okay, so this slide is really a follow-up to that turbidity discussion. So in addition to measuring the turbidity or seeing how dirty your water is, it's important to show or to talk to growers about what are some of the other variables that they could consider in meeting that regulatory requirement. Okay, so kind of to wrap up this whole management section, we talked about some of those variables that will impact the effectiveness of the sanitizer or of the water treatment. Now we talk a little bit about disposal of used water, but again, this is just really wrapping up that discussion of some of those key water treatment variables and water management variables. So when do you change the water, things like that? How do you dispose of it? But the next section that I really wanted to highlight to kind of wrap up this whole module presentation is this last section of, okay, how do you recommend to a grower, how do they select a sanitizer? So what are the key factors to consider? And we go through a couple of statements here. We mentioned that there are a number of chemistries available, but I will highlight for you as trainers, I think what we present here in the next couple of slides is a very broad topic. So this is a broad introduction, if you will, of how do you select a sanitizer. And there are a number of other good resources to delve into if growers are interested. And we talk a little bit about following the label. And I wanted to highlight this fact sheet that Produce Safety Alliance developed that kind of goes through, again, if growers wanted something to take home and sit down and read, that's relatively quick. This is a fact sheet that I think will help them get there. How do they select a sanitizer from the EPA labeling perspective? And then there are other fact sheets listed in the notes if they're looking for specific chemistries. Say, if they're trying to decide between a chlorine-based product or a peroxyacetic-based product. And here, in order to sort of wrap up this discussion, I wanted to highlight this tool that we have up on the website. We call it the PSA Sanitizer Tool. And this is essentially a way to select a sanitizer that has an EPA label, because that is highly recommended in the produce safety realm. So I wanted to mention here that for anybody who is not familiar with this tool or who has never used it before, this is up on the website. You can find it through the trainer resources page or the general resources page. And essentially, it's a way that you can sort, or your growers can sort by active ingredient, label information. And really the thing that I want to highlight, and the selfish reason for talking about this today, is this tool will be updated, I expect next week. So I just wanted to mention that if you plan on using this tool in the near future, if you have it downloaded on your desktop, I recommend going back to the PSA website and downloading the new version. Essentially, we're updating it for 2020. We're adding in a couple of columns and just changing a few things based on industry recommendations. And if you have questions, we do always keep version notes. So if you download the new version, you can take a look and see what exactly was updated. And I just wanted to highlight what this labeled use page looks like, because this is a quick and easy way to reference the EPA label, because we directly link to those EPA labels for certain products. And again, it's just a way to help the grower without making recommendations. It's a way to help the grower kind of see what chemistries might be available. So say a grower is looking for a peroxyacetic acid product that can be used for treating food contact surfaces and wash water. They could use that tool to kind of help see what is out there. Okay, so in order to wrap up this discussion, we talk a lot about monitoring antimicrobial treatments. So again, this is a nice place. I lost my props. Here we are. This is a nice place during in-person courses. I will often pass around these strips that I keep on hand. Sometimes we'll do a little mock filling out a record based on some of these strips. But this is a little bit more limited in remote courses. So I do still kind of show off props when I present this information. However, it is a little bit more limited than in-person uses. But the thing that I want to highlight about this next slide is this is an optional slide. So we do bring up oxidation reduction potential. It is optional. So the thing I want to highlight here is it's really a matter of knowing your audience. So if I'm working with small growers who are just getting into post-harvest water treatment, honestly, I usually don't present this slide because those growers are probably going to, at least when they start off, likely they're going to start off with strips and maybe a titration kit to help determine and help get their system going. So in order to wrap up this module, we have a couple of example standard operating procedures that we list out. The primary thing here I want to highlight as a trainer is I like using this list as a way to show off some of the example standard operating procedures that exist out there. So one of this particular one is for changing post-harvest water. This is pulled from the National GAPS program website under educational materials. It's part of the decision trees. So if you are working with growers who are starting from, with nothing, I highly recommend using some of the sample SOPs. There is language for a farm food safety plan, sample log sheets, things like that, because I really like recommending the use of standard operating procedures as a teaching tool. So when growers are writing down the procedure of how they actually treat their water, it's really helpful to go back to and kind of using that as an instruction manual, either for, getting back to it after a long off season or when they're training new workers. We talk a little bit about corrective actions. So again, when I present this, I really like having growers walk through an example. So I will pick one of those following bullets and actually walk them through how does the monitoring demonstrate that the sanitizer is below the effective level? What are they going to do about it? What are those corrective actions? And then lastly, record keeping. The thing I wanted to highlight about the records, and I mentioned this when I went over the learning objectives, was when we talk about the records, it's really great for keeping an eye on the monitoring. So how is your water treatment going? Is it being effective? And I want to leave ample time for questions. So I'm going to actually stop here. You are very familiar with the summary. Again, when I present this summary, I like to highlight the flow of the module. So talking about that initial water quality, and then all of those management practices to keep that water at a safe and acceptable level.